Fifth-generation farmer Thomas Calloway woke to the sound of military trucks surrounding his property, just hours after he'd stood defiantly in front of bulldozers to protect a 600-year-old oak tree. As U.S. Army Corps of Engineers established a security perimeter and deployed ground-penetrating radar around the ancient oak, Thomas was confronted with a shocking truth. His family's humble tree harbored a secret of such national significance that it would rewrite American history and shatter everything he believed about his own ancestry. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Hickory Ridge Farm sits on the western slopes of the Blue Ridge Mountains in rural North Carolina, where the Callaway family has worked the same 120 acres for 5 generations. Its weathered red barn and fields of corn and tobacco are typical of the region, but one feature stands out to anyone passing by: an enormous white oak tree, its massive canopy spanning over 160 feet, dominating the landscape from its position on a natural rise near the center of the property. Local historians estimate the Callaway Oak to be at least 600 years old, making it one of the oldest documented white oaks in the eastern United States. Its trunk measures over 8 feet in diameter, with gnarled branches reaching skyward like ancient fingers trying to touch the clouds. The tree's position on the highest point of the property ensures it's visible for miles around, serving as a natural landmark for travelers since before European settlement of the region. Thomas Calloway, now 58, inherited the farm from his father, after returning from military service as an Army Ranger in his late 20s. His father, James Calloway, had suffered a debilitating stroke shortly after Thomas's return from his 3rd deployment, leaving the young veteran to take over the family business earlier than expected. The transition from military precision to the unpredictable rhythms of agriculture hadn't been easy, but Thomas had approached farming with the same disciplined dedication he'd shown in the service. Unlike many of his neighbors who modernized and expanded, Thomas maintained the farm's modest size, focusing on sustainable practices and heirloom crop varieties that had sustained his family for generations. This decision wasn't merely sentimental. Thomas had witnessed environmental devastation during his deployments overseas and returned home determined to be a steward rather than an exploiter of the land. My great-grandfather kept records of every crop rotation, every weather pattern, every success and failure on this land, Thomas explains, carefully turning the pages of a journal dated 1893. These books taught me more about farming than any agricultural college ever could. 7 generations of knowledge written in their own hands. The Callaway Oak, as locals called it, had been a fixture of family lore since before the Civil War. Thomas's great-great-grandfather Jeremiah Callaway had supposedly rested beneath its branches after returning wounded from Gettysburg, vowing that as long as his family owned this land, the oak would stand protected. Each generation of Callaways had maintained this promise, working around the massive tree, despite its inconvenient location in what could have been prime agricultural land. The story goes that Jeremiah was shot twice at Gettysburg, Thomas recounts, pointing to the faded image. He wasn't expected to survive the journey home, but he insisted on seeing the oak one more time. They brought him here on a wagon, and something about being under that tree helped him recover. The local doctor called it a miracle. Whether miracle or merely the restorative power of being home, Jeremiah did recover and went on to father 5 children, establishing the Callaway lineage that would maintain Hickory Ridge Farm through the Reconstruction, the Great Depression, 2 world wars, and into the modern era. The farm itself had changed relatively little over the decades. At 120 acres, it was considered small by modern standards, but its soil remained rich and productive thanks to the sustainable practices passed down through generations. The main crops, corn, tobacco, and more recently, organic vegetables for local farmers' markets, provided a modest but stable income that had allowed the Calloways to maintain their independence while larger farms around them were absorbed by agricultural corporations. Over the years, the Callaway Oak had become something of a local attraction. School groups regularly visited to learn about dendrochronology, the science of dating events through tree rings, and environmental conservation. Thomas had established a small educational program teaching local children about sustainable agriculture and the importance of preserving natural heritage. This tree was already 300 years old when the first European settlers arrived in this valley, he tells. The wide-eyed children, "It's seen Native American tribes hunting these forests, Revolutionary War soldiers marching past, and every generation of my family working this land. If we take care of it, it might stand for another 600 years. Thomas himself had grown. Up climbing its massive branches, carved his initials alongside those of his ancestors in its bark, and later proposed to his late wife Rebecca under its canopy. After losing Rebecca to cancer 5 years ago, the oak had become an even more significant spiritual anchor for Thomas, a living connection to both his family's past and his own personal history. Rebecca loved this tree almost as much as I do, Thomas says softly, tracing the carving he'd made 40 years earlier as a lovesick teenager. Before she passed, she made me promise 2 things: to never sell the farm, and to make sure the oak would always be protected. The oak wasn't just a tree, it was the heart of Hickory Ridge and the physical embodiment of the Callaway family's connection to this land. It represented continuity in a world of constant change, a living monument to the notion that some things deserve to be preserved simply because they have endured. Little did Thomas know that this deep personal connection to an ancient tree was about to thrust him into a confrontation that would test his resolve, challenge his understanding of his family's history, and ultimately reveal secrets that had been literally rooted in his land for centuries. While the majestic Callaway Oak had stood sentinel over Hickory Ridge Farm for centuries, the modern world was closing in. Thomas gazed across his eastern property line toward the recently cleared land, where construction equipment now sat idle for the evening. Emerald Creek Estates. That's what the glossy brochures called the luxury development that had been consuming neighboring farms for the past 3 years. When Thomas had first heard about the development plans, they seemed distant, someone else's. Concern. But farm by farm, his neighbors had sold their land, enticed by offers that far exceeded agricultural value. The Millers, the Prestons, the Dawson family, all gone now, their barns demolished, their fields carved into 5-acre lots for executive country estates with mountain views. They offered me 3 times what this place is worth, Thomas explained, leaning against his tractor as late afternoon sun cast long shadows across his cornfield. Said I could retire comfortably, maybe buy a condo at the beach. As if I could ever leave this land. Retirement was a foreign concept to Thomas. At 58, he still worked from sunrise to sunset most days, his body strong from decades of physical labor. The rhythm of planting and harvest, the satisfaction of working land his ancestors had tended, these were not things he could simply walk away from. But the pressure was mounting. Property taxes had nearly doubled in the past 5 years as the surrounding area transitioned from agricultural to residential. The county assessor valued his land based on its highest and best use, which, according to their calculations, was no longer farming, but development. Meanwhile, the small tobacco allocation that had once been a reliable income source had diminished in value as domestic tobacco production declined. The organic vegetables Thomas had diversified into brought decent returns at the local farmers' markets, but those markets were increasingly filled with hobbyist growers from the very subdivisions encroaching on traditional farmland. Most of the county's actual farmers are gone now, Thomas said, gazing toward the distant Blue Ridge Mountains, glowing purple in the evening light. There's maybe 5 of us left who make our entire living from the land. Everyone else has either sold out or taken second jobs in town. Financial concerns weren't the only pressures. The new Emerald Creek residents had begun to complain about the realities of living next to a working farm. The early morning tractor noise, the occasional farm odors, the dust during plowing season. The county commissioners, once dominated by agricultural interests, now represented a constituency of transplants and retirees who prioritized property values over farming heritage. The situation had reached a crisis point 3 months ago when Thomas received an official letter regarding water rights. The Emerald Creek development needed additional water capacity for its planned community pool and ornamental fountains. Their engineers had identified an aquifer that ran beneath both their property and the southern corner of Hickory Ridge Farm. The developers had requested an easement to drill wells on Thomas's land, wells that would potentially reduce the water table that fed both his crops and the ancient oak. When Thomas refused, they hinted at potential legal action based on riparian rights and reasonable use doctrines. "My grandfather always said water would be more valuable than oil someday," Thomas remembered, walking toward the natural spring that bubbled up near the base of the oak tree. The spring had never run dry, even during the worst droughts, providing Hickory Ridge with reliable irrigation for generations. This spring wasn't merely practical, it figured prominently in family law. Jeremiah Callaway had chosen this particular plot of land specifically because of the spring and the oak that stood beside it. Family journals suggested he'd paid more for this property than for better farmland available elsewhere, a decision that puzzled his contemporaries, but was vindicated by the farm's remarkable resilience during drought years. Thomas had been carefully monitoring the spring's flow rate since the development began clearing land to the east. Already, he'd noticed a slight decrease. Nothing catastrophic yet, but a troubling sign of changes to the local hydrology. If the developers tapped into the same aquifer with industrial pumps, the consequences could be devastating not just for his crops, but for the ancient oak that depended on the consistent groundwater. The Callaway Oak itself presented another point of contention. While it stood well within his property boundaries, its massive canopy was visible for miles and had become something of a landmark. The developers had initially approached Thomas about incorporating views of the tree into their marketing materials, suggesting it would add authentic historical character to their community. When Thomas declined, their interest shifted to something more concerning. Through public records requests, he discovered the development company had hired an arborist to assess the oak's health and condition. Thomas found the man taking core samples without permission, a legal grey area since he was standing on the public road while extending his tools over the property line. "They're looking for ammunition," Thomas's attorney had warned him after reviewing documents from the County Planning Commission. "If they can prove the tree is diseased or hazardous, they might petition for a removal order regardless of its location on private property." The threat to the oak struck at Thomas's core. During the most difficult times of his life, when he returned from combat struggling with the transition to civilian life, when Rebecca received her terminal diagnosis, when he buried both his parents within a year of each other, the ancient tree had been a source of solace and continuity. Its branches had sheltered generations of Callaways through personal and national upheavals, a living monument to perseverance. More pragmatically, Thomas knew the oak's extensive root system helped prevent erosion on the sloped terrain where it stood. Its removal would potentially destabilize the entire hillside, threatening both the natural spring and the structural integrity of his land. Thomas had fortified his position through every legal means available. He'd registered the Callaway Oak in the National Register of Champion Trees, documented its historical significance through university researchers, and established a conservation easement on the central portion of his property where the tree stood. But paper protections felt increasingly flimsy against the determined pressure of development and profit. The breaking point came yesterday morning. Thomas had risen before dawn, as was his habit, to check on a section of fence that needed repair. As he approached the eastern boundary of his property, in the grey pre-dawn light, he spotted unfamiliar vehicles parked along the county road. 3 white pickup trucks with the Emerald Creek Development logo emblazoned on their doors. Beside them stood a larger vehicle he recognized immediately from his construction days before joining the military. A tree removal service, complete with industrial chipper and crane equipment. Men in hard hats were consulting plans spread across the hood of one truck, pointing occasionally toward the Callaway Oak, silhouetted majestically against the lightning sky. Thomas approached them directly, boots crunching on gravel. His presence causing a sudden cessation in their conversation. "Gentlemen," he said simply, "you're looking at my tree." What followed was a carefully choreographed explanation. The project manager, a smooth-talking man in a polo shirt bearing the development company logo, claimed they were merely assessing options for the viewshed. The tree removal contractor avoided eye contact entirely. When Thomas pressed further, the truth emerged in bureaucratic fragments. The developers had applied for a special county variance, claiming the oak posed a threat to planned infrastructure, specifically that its root system might eventually damage the water lines they intended to install along the road easement. "We have approval for preliminary work," the project manager claimed, producing a document with an official-looking seal. "This survey is entirely legal from the public right-of-way." Thomas scanned the document, recognizing it as a standard work permit for the road shoulder, something that would allow trimming branches overhanging public property, but certainly not removal of the tree itself. The deliberate misrepresentation ignited a slow-burning anger in Thomas's chest. "That tree doesn't overhang public property," he stated flatly. "And if your equipment crosses my property line, even by an inch, I'll have the sheriff out here before you can start your engines." The confrontation escalated as Thomas photographed their equipment and license plates with his phone. The project manager made veiled references to inevitable progress, economic development, and the futility of standing in its way. When Thomas remained unmoved, the man's professional veneer cracked slightly. "Look, Mr. Calloway, this is happening whether you'd like it or not. We have investors, commitments, and a construction timeline. That tree is directly in the view line for our premium lots. Be reasonable. We can make this worth your while." Thomas's response was to position himself directly between the crew and his property line, feet planted firmly, arms crossed. The standoff lasted nearly 2 hours, with Thomas refusing to budge even as the workers packed up their immediate equipment, and the project manager made increasingly frustrated phone calls. "I'll die before I let you touch that tree," Thomas told them as they finally prepared to leave. "And that's not a figure of speech." The project manager's parting words had lingered ominously. "We'll be back tomorrow with the proper documentation. Suggest you consult with your attorney about obstruction of legally permitted activities." As twilight settled over Hickory Ridge Farm, Thomas sat on his porch watching lightning bugs begin their evening dance over the fields. He'd spent the day reinforcing his legal position, calling his attorney, contacting the county environmental officer, and reaching out to a group that had helped with the tree's champion registration. The responses had been frustratingly non-committal. Legal proceedings would take time. The county environmental officer was out on vacation. The conservation group could send someone next week. Thomas knew the developers wouldn't wait. Their tactics followed a familiar pattern he'd seen with neighboring properties: move quickly, create facts on the ground, and deal with objections after the fact. An apology and fine for premature tree removal would be a minor cost of doing business compared to the premium they could charge for unobstructed Mountain View lots. As darkness fell completely, Thomas made a decision. He loaded his old pickup truck with camping gear, a thermos of coffee, and his grandfather's double-barreled shotgun, not as a threat, but as a connection to the generations that had defended this land before him. He drove to the eastern boundary and parked directly in front of the property line, headlights illuminating the no trespassing signs he'd recently reinforced. He would stand guard through the night. No matter what documentation they returned with tomorrow, they would find Thomas Calloway physically defending the tree that had defined his family for generations. What Thomas couldn't possibly know was that by morning, the tree removal crew would be the least of his concerns. Forces far beyond local developers were about to take an interest in the Callaway Oak, forces with the authority to override both private property rights and commercial interests in the name of national security. Dawn broke over Hickory Ridge Farm with the soft golden light that had greeted countless generations of Callaways. Thomas stirred in the cab of his pickup, stiff from spending the night in the driver's seat. His coffee thermos had long since emptied, and the morning dew coated the windshield in a fine mist. He rubbed his weathered face and checked his watch. 5:47 a.m. The developers wouldn't likely arrive until after 8, but Thomas had no intention of leaving his post. As he stepped out of the truck to stretch his legs, the early morning silence was broken by an unexpected sound, a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath his feet. At first, Thomas attributed it to distant thunder, but the clear sky contradicted this explanation. The vibration intensified, and Thomas realized it was coming from the direction of the county road. Within minutes, the source of the disturbance became clear as 3 military-style vehicles turned onto the gravel access road leading to his property. Not the white pickup trucks of the development company, but olive-drab Humvees bearing official government markings. They moved with purposeful precision, maintaining perfect distance from one another as they approached. Thomas stood his ground as the vehicles came to a stop about 50 yards from his position. 6 individuals emerged, 4 men and 2 women, all dressed in matching khaki uniforms that weren't quite military but carried the unmistakable bearing of government authority. Their patches identified them as members of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, a detail that momentarily confused Thomas. What interest could the Army Corps have in a land dispute between a farmer and developers? A tall, grey-haired man with the ramrod-straight posture of career military approached. "Mr. Thomas Calloway?" he inquired formally. Thomas nodded, his hand instinctively tightening around his grandfather's shotgun. "Colonel James Harrington, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Raleigh Division," the man introduced himself, offering a government ID card. "I need to speak with you regarding the white oak specimen on your property." "If this is about the development company's claims," Thomas began. "I've already filed—" Colonel Harrington raised a hand. "This has nothing to do with any private development interests, Mr. Calloway. This is a matter of significant federal concern. May we speak somewhere more comfortable? Perhaps your home?" Thomas hesitated, scanning the assembled team. Behind them, 2 more vehicles were turning onto his property, large white trucks with satellite equipment and what appeared to be ground-scanning technology. Whatever was happening, it clearly extended beyond a simple property dispute. "I'd prefer to know why the Army is suddenly interested in my oak tree before inviting you into my home," Thomas replied evenly, drawing on the calm assertiveness that had served him well during military confrontations. Colonel Harrington nodded, respecting the boundary. Fair enough. At approximately 2:30 a.m. this morning, a seismic monitoring station in Asheville registered an anomalous energy signature originating from this exact location. The pattern matched certain classified parameters that trigger automatic notification to our department. Thomas frowned. Seismic activity. We occasionally get minor tremors, but I didn't feel anything unusual last night. This wasn't a geological event, one of the women explained, stepping forward. Her uniform identified her as Dr. Eleanor Chen, scientific advisor. The energy signature we detected has specific characteristics consistent with certain phenomena of interest to national security. Thomas looked between them skeptically. You're telling me my oak tree is suddenly a matter of national security? Not suddenly, Mr. Callaway, Colonel Harrington replied with measured precision. We have reason to believe the anomalous properties of this specific tree have been present for centuries. What changed last night was a significant intensification of those properties, strong enough to trigger our detection systems. Thomas's mind raced, trying to connect this bizarre conversation to anything in his experience. What properties are you talking about? Dr. Chen and Colonel Harrington exchanged glances. That's classified information, sir, the colonel stated. But I'm authorized to tell you that similar signatures have been detected at only 4 other locations across the eastern United States over the past 70 years. Each instance has been associated with unusually ancient trees growing over specialized geological formations. As Thomas struggled to process this information, a memory surfaced from his childhood. His grandfather, showing him a strange metal object he claimed to have found near the oak's roots after a particularly severe storm had temporarily uprooted part of the massive tree. Thomas had dismissed it as one of his grandfather's tall tales. But now he wondered. You believe there's something beneath my tree? Thomas stated, watching their reactions carefully. Colonel Harrington's expression remained neutral, but Dr. Chen's slight widening of eyes confirmed Thomas's suspicion. Mr. Callaway, Colonel Harrington continued, I have authorization to establish a temporary research perimeter around the specimen for national security purposes. This directive supersedes local jurisdiction. He produced an official document, bearing multiple government seals. We'll need approximately 72 hours of uninterrupted access. Thomas took the document, but didn't immediately read it. Instead, he gestured toward the development company's property line. And what about them? They're planning to remove the tree entirely. They claim to have county approval. That won't be happening, Colonel Harrington stated with absolute certainty. As of 400 hours this morning, your property has been designated a temporary secure research zone under federal jurisdiction. No local development activities will be permitted within 500 yards of the specimen during our investigation. The colonel's words should have been reassuring. The immediate threat to the oak had apparently been neutralized. Yet Thomas felt a growing unease. Whatever had brought the Army Corps of Engineers to his doorstep at dawn involved concepts beyond local zoning. Disputes. Terms like anomalous energy signature and classified parameters suggested something far outside ordinary experience. Dr. Chen approached, her expression softening slightly. Mr. Callaway, your family has maintained this property for generations. Correct? Thomas nodded. 5 generations, since after the Civil War. And the tree has always been protected by your family? Yes. My great-great-grandfather Jeremiah made it a condition when he purchased the land. Every Callaway since has honored that commitment. Dr. Chen glanced at Colonel Harrington, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. Mr. Callaway, did any of your ancestors serve in specialized military units? Perhaps in roles that involved unusual duties or required high security clearances? The question caught Thomas off guard. My father was Army infantry in Korea. I served as an Army ranger. Beyond that, he trailed off, suddenly remembering a curious detail from his grandfather's military records. A 6-month period marked simply as special assignment, with no elaboration. My grandfather, he had some kind of special assignment during World War II. He never talked about it, said he was sworn to secrecy. This detail created a ripple of interest among the assembled team. Dr. Chen made a note on a tablet. She carried, and Colonel Harrington's posture shifted subtly. "Mr. Callaway," the colonel said, his tone now less formal, "I believe your family's connection to this property, and specifically to that tree, may not be entirely coincidental. There are certain patterns we've observed across the 5 identified, sites that suggest continuity of guardianship." Thomas stared at him, trying to process the implications. "You're saying my family was placed here deliberately to guard the tree?" "Not exactly," Dr. Chen interjected. "Rather, certain individuals throughout history have demonstrated sensitivity to the energy signatures we're investigating. These individuals often find themselves drawn to locations where these signatures are present. They become protective of these sites, often without understanding why." The white trucks had now positioned themselves near the oak tree and were deploying what looked like ground-penetrating radar equipment. Thomas watched with growing apprehension as technicians in white coveralls began establishing a perimeter around his family's sacred tree. "I need to know exactly what you're looking for," Thomas demanded, turning back to Colonel Harrington. "This is still my property. That tree has been in my family's care for generations. I have a right to know." "What's happening?" Colonel Harrington considered this for a moment, then gestured toward his vehicle. "Walk with me, Mr. Callaway." As they moved out of earshot from the others, the colonel spoke in a lowered voice. "What I'm about to tell you is classified, but given your family's apparent historical connection, you're entitled to certain information." He paused, seemingly weighing his words carefully. In 1947, a top-secret government program called Project Verdant was established to investigate unusual energy patterns associated with certain ancient trees across North America. "Like Roswell?" Thomas asked skeptically. "You're talking about aliens?" The colonel offered a thin smile. "Nothing so dramatic. These energy signatures appear to be entirely terrestrial in origin, but they exhibit properties we still don't fully understand, properties that could have significant applications for energy production, communications technology, and certain defensive systems. And you think my oak tree is one of these energy sources?" "Not the tree itself," Colonel Harrington clarified. "Rather, certain ancient trees grow in symbiotic relationship with underground geological formations that generate these energy fields. The tree's root systems appear to function as natural conduits, occasionally releasing excess energy into the atmosphere, which is what our sensors detected last night." Thomas processed this information in silence as they walked. The explanation was simultaneously too fantastic to believe and too precise to dismiss entirely. It would explain his family's seemingly irrational dedication to preserving the oak. At all costs, the spring that never ran dry even in drought years, and perhaps even the unusual fertility of Hickory Ridge soil compared to neighboring farms. "Why now?" Thomas finally asked. "If this tree has been here for centuries, why is your team showing up today?" Colonel Harrington's expression grew serious. "Because the energy signature we detected last night was the strongest ever recorded at any of the 5 sites. Something has changed, Mr. Callaway. Something has activated the system in a way we've never seen before." Thomas thought of the developers, their equipment positioned near the oak just yesterday. Could external interference trigger this? Someone taking soil samples or core samples from the tree? The colonel stopped walking abruptly. Was the tree physically disturbed recently? Yesterday morning, the development company sent an arborist to take core samples, illegally from the road. I stopped them. but not before they extracted at least one sample. Colonel Harrington immediately raised his radio, issuing rapid instructions to his team. The pace of activity around the oak noticeably increased, with additional equipment being deployed from the trucks. "Mr. Callaway," the colonel said gravely, "I need to know exactly who took that sample and where it might be now. The material from these trees has unique properties that can be highly unstable when removed from the energy field. In the wrong hands, or handled incorrectly, it could be dangerous." The weight of the situation finally hit Thomas fully. This wasn't about property rights or environmental conservation anymore. Something truly extraordinary was happening. Something connected to his family's past and potentially important enough to warrant immediate federal intervention. As the morning sun rose higher, casting the ancient oak's shadow across the fields his ancestors had tilled for generations, Thomas Calloway found himself at a crossroads. The tree he had spent his life protecting apparently harbored secrets far beyond anything he had imagined. And now he had to decide whether to cooperate with these government officials or continue standing his ground, defending his family's legacy against yet another outside force that claimed authority over it. "I'll help you find the sample," Thomas decided finally. "But I want complete transparency about what you discover on my land, and I stay with the tree during your entire investigation. Those are my conditions." Colonel Harrington extended his hand. "Agreed. Welcome to Project Verdant, Mr. Callaway. I suspect your grandfather would be proud." Thomas stood beside Colonel Harrington as the Army Corps team established a perimeter around the ancient oak. The morning sun cast long shadows across Hickory Ridge Farm, and a light mist still clung to the lower fields. The scene before him seemed surreal. Military-grade equipment positioned around a tree his ancestors had climbed, white-suited technicians taking readings from the soil his family had farmed for generations. "We'll need a comprehensive history of the tree and any unusual events associated with it," Dr. Chen explained, walking Thomas toward a mobile command center that had been set up near his barn. "Anything your family might have documented, growth anomalies, strange weather patterns, unexpected wildlife behavior, unexplained phenomena." Thomas thought of his family journals spanning back to Jeremiah's time. "My ancestors kept detailed records, but they were practical farmers, not scientists. They documented crop yields, weather patterns, maintenance of the property. I'm not sure they would have recorded anything unusual." Dr. Chen smiled patiently. "Sometimes the most valuable historical data is embedded in ordinary observations. A spring that never runs dry during drought years. Crops that thrive despite blights affecting neighboring farms. Wildlife exhibiting uncommon behavior around specific locations. Your family might have documented these things without recognizing their significance." Her words struck a chord with Thomas. There were indeed peculiarities about Hickory Ridge that he'd taken for granted, the consistent productivity of soil, that neighboring farmers had once considered marginal, the way certain plants grew more vigorously near the oak, the unusual clarity and purity of the spring water. "There might be something in the journals," he conceded. "My grandfather was particularly meticulous in his observations." As they entered the barn, Thomas noticed it had been transformed in the brief time since his attention had been directed elsewhere. Computer workstations had been established, satellite communication equipment installed, and detailed topographical maps of his property spread across tables. The efficiency with which the team had set up operations suggested considerable experience. "With similar deployments, you've done this before," Thomas observed, "investigating these energy sources." Colonel Harrington nodded. "Project Verdant has been operational for over 70 years, Mr. Callaway. While incidents of this magnitude are rare, we maintain constant monitoring of all identified sites." "And how many sites are there exactly?" The colonel hesitated briefly. 5 confirmed locations in North America, 3 others under investigation. Thomas processed this information. And my oak is one of the confirmed sites. The Callaway Oak has been on our monitoring list since 1958, Dr. Chen confirmed, bringing up historical data on a computer screen. That's when your grandfather's property first registered on our detection systems. The year struck Thomas as significant. 1958, that's when grandfather nearly lost the farm during the drought. The bank was foreclosing, but then he suddenly had enough money to pay off the entire mortgage. Dr. Chen and Colonel Harrington exchanged glances. He always claimed it was from back pay the military owed him, Thomas continued, but that never quite added up. Colonel Harrington cleared his throat. Your grandfather, Edward Callaway, was recruited into Project Verdant as a civilian consultant in 1958. His military experience combined with his position as the property owner made him ideally suited for our purposes. The revelation landed. Like a physical blow, Thomas stared at the colonel, trying to reconcile this information with the grandfather he had known, a practical, straightforward farmer who had taught him to respect the land and protect the family oak. You're saying my grandfather knew about whatever is happening with the tree? Not initially, Colonel Harrington clarified. He was approached after our monitoring systems detected the first major energy surge from this location. The drought of '58 created conditions that apparently activated the underground formation. Your grandfather was skeptical at first, but once he witnessed the evidence firsthand, he became one of our most valuable allies. Thomas's mind reeled with implications. And my father, did he know too? Dr. Chen shook her head. Project Verdant operates on a need-to-know basis. Your grandfather chose not to involve your father, believing the responsibility would be too burdensome alongside managing the farm. The intention was for Edward to eventually brief you directly, but his sudden death from heart failure in 1997 occurred before the planned disclosure. Thomas felt a complex mix of emotions: betrayal that his grandfather had kept such a monumental secret, understanding of the burden such knowledge would carry, and a strange sense of continuity, as if he were finally stepping into a role that had been waiting for him all along. I need to see my grandfather's journals, Thomas decided. There might be coded information, things that didn't make sense to me before but would now. With Dr. Chen accompanying him, Thomas returned to the farmhouse and retrieved the collection of leather-bound journals from the old oak cabinet in his study. Generations of Callaways had maintained this tradition, recording not just agricultural data but family histories, personal reflections, and observations about the land. Thomas had read most of these volumes over the years, finding practical farming, wisdom, and emotional connection to his ancestors, but now he wondered what other information might be hidden in their pages, what secrets his grandfather might have embedded in seemingly mundane observations. While Thomas gathered the journals, Dr. Chen examined the study with professional curiosity. Her attention was drawn to a framed map on the wall, a hand-drawn survey of Hickory Ridge dating from Jeremiah Callaway's original purchase. "May I?" she asked, lifting the frame from its hook without waiting for permission. Thomas looked up from the cabinet. "That's been hanging there since before I was born, my great-great-grandfather's original property survey." Dr. Chen carefully removed the backing of the frame, revealing that behind the survey map was another older document, a faded parchment covered with unfamiliar symbols and diagrams. "Mr. Callaway," she said quietly, "do you know what this is?" Thomas approached, staring at the hidden document with confusion. "I've never seen that before. It must have been behind the survey map all along." Dr. Chen handled the parchment with reverence, using a small penlight to examine the faded markings. "These symbols are consistent with artifacts recovered from other Verdant sites. This appears to be a schematic of some kind, possibly mapping the underground formation beneath your oak." The colonel entered the study, immediately focused on their discovery. "Where did you find this?" "Behind my family's property survey," Thomas explained, still processing the implications. "It's been hanging on that wall for decades, but I never knew about the hidden document." Colonel Harrington studied the symbols intently. "This changes a timeline significantly. These markings suggest awareness of the site's properties dating back to the original land purchase. Your great-great-grandfather didn't stumble upon this property by chance, Mr. Callaway. He sought it out specifically." Thomas thought of the family story, how Jeremiah had paid above market value for land others considered marginal, how he had insisted on the oak's protection as a non-negotiable condition for all future generations. What if these weren't merely the sentimental actions of a war-weary soldier, but deliberate steps taken by someone with knowledge of the tree's true significance? "We should return to the oak," Colonel Harrington decided, carefully preserving the discovered document. "Dr. Chen, have the imaging team seen this? The configuration matches their preliminary scans almost exactly." As they emerged from the farmhouse, Thomas noticed significant changes to the scene around the ancient oak. A complete security perimeter had been established, with advanced monitoring equipment positioned at regular intervals. A large tent now stood near the tree, housing what appeared to be laboratory equipment. The white trucks had deployed satellite dishes and communication arrays. Most notably, the team had begun excavation near one of the oak's massive root structures. A careful, methodical process using tools more suited to an archaeological dig than a military operation. "What are they looking for?" Thomas asked, watching technicians gently brush soil away from an exposed root system. "Based on patterns observed at other sites," Dr. Chen explained, "we believe there may be artifacts integrated with the root structure, objects that interact with the energy field in specific ways." As they approached the excavation area, a technician emerged from the tent, carrying what appeared to be a core sample container, similar to what the development company's arborist had used, but clearly more sophisticated. "Dr. Chen," the technician called, "you need to see this immediately." Inside the tent, a digital microscope displayed magnified images of wood tissue from the oak. Even to Thomas's untrained eye, there was something unusual about the cellular structure. Tiny formations that seemed to shimmer with an inner light, patterns that appeared almost crystalline rather than organic. "The crystalline structures are more developed than at any other site we've documented," the technician explained. "The integration is nearly perfect." Dr. Chen studied the images with intense concentration. "Concentration levels 30% higher than our previous highest reading," the technician confirmed, "and actively increasing." Colonel Harrington turned to Thomas. "The development company's arborist, you said they took at least one core sample yesterday?" Thomas nodded. "Yes, from the north side of the trunk. They were doing it from the road, trying to stay technically off my property." "And you have no idea where that sample might be now?" "The company headquarters would be my guess. Emerald Creek Development has an office in Asheville." The colonel immediately issued orders for a team to locate and secure the missing sample. Thomas caught phrases like containment protocols and radiation precautions that heightened his concern about exactly what they were dealing with. "Is the sample dangerous?" Thomas asked directly. Dr. Chen chose her words carefully. "The material itself isn't hazardous in the conventional sense, but separated from the energy field that sustains it, the crystalline structures begin a rapid degradation process. This releases the stored energy in unpredictable ways, like a battery leaking acid," Thomas suggested. "More like a small nuclear reactor losing its containment," Colonel Harrington corrected grimly. "On a significantly smaller scale, of course, but potentially harmful to anyone handling the material without proper precautions." Thomas felt the weight of responsibility settling deeper onto his shoulders. This was no longer just about protecting a family heirloom or standing against developers. Lives could potentially be at risk. including those of people who had no idea what they were dealing with. "I know someone at the development company," Thomas offered. "Not a friend exactly, but someone who might help us without raising too many alarms. The company's environmental compliance officer. She's new, brought in to improve their public image. She seemed uncomfortable with their tactics when we spoke last month." Colonel Harrington nodded. "Make the call. We need to recover that sample as quickly and quietly as possible." As Thomas reached for his phone, a commotion near the security perimeter drew their attention. A black SUV had pulled up to the temporary checkpoint established at the farm's entrance, and 3 men in business suits were engaged in heated discussion with the security personnel. Emerald Creek executives? Thomas recognized them immediately. "Looks like they've brought reinforcements. That's their chief legal counsel with them." Colonel Harrington straightened his uniform. "I'll handle this. Please continue with your call, Mr. Callaway. The sample is our priority." As the colonel strode purposefully toward the confrontation, Thomas dialed the number for Catherine Bennett, the development company's environmental officer. He watched the scene unfolding at the perimeter, the development executives gesturing. Angrily, the colonel remaining immovable, security personnel taking up positions that were subtle but unmistakably defensive. The call connected after 3 rings. "Catherine Bennett," a professional female voice answered. "Ms. Bennett, this is Thomas Calloway from Hickory Ridge Farm." A pause. "Mr. Calloway, this is unexpected. If you're calling about yesterday's incident, I should inform you that our legal team is already—" "I'm not calling about that," Thomas interrupted. "I'm calling about the core sample your arborist took from my oak tree. It's extremely important that I know where it is right now." Another pause, longer this time. "Why would that concern you, Mr. Callaway? The sample was taken from the public right-of-way, which is entirely legal." Thomas took a deep breath, searching for words that would convey urgency without revealing classified information. "Ms. Bennett, I believe you're someone who takes environmental safety seriously. That sample may contain compounds that could be harmful if improperly handled. I need your help to ensure no one is accidentally exposed." The line went quiet, but Thomas could hear papers shuffling in the background. When Catherine spoke again, her voice had lost its professional detachment. "Mr. Callaway, how did you know about the anomalous readings? Our lab only completed the preliminary analysis this morning." Thomas felt a chill. "What kind of anomalous readings, Ms. Bennett?" "The organic structure contains unknown crystalline formations. Our equipment, well, 2 analytical devices malfunctioned during testing, and the technician reported unusual effects. Headaches, visual disturbances. We've quarantined the sample and called in a specialist." Thomas made eye contact with Dr. Chen, who had been monitoring his call. She mouthed, "Put her on speaker," which Thomas immediately did. "Ms. Bennett," Dr. Chen interjected, "this is Dr. Eleanor Chen with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. We need you to secure that sample immediately and prevent any further testing. A qualified team is en route to your facility now." "Army Corps of Engineers?" Catherine's voice registered surprise. "What possible interest would you have in an oak tree sample?" "The sample contains materials of federal interest," Dr. Chen stated firmly. "Please cooperate fully with our recovery team when they arrive." Thomas could hear the sound of a door opening on Catherine's end of the call, followed by muffled voices. "I have to go," Catherine said abruptly. "But Mr. Callaway, you should know that our CEO ordered comprehensive testing on the sample. They're moving it to our main research facility in Charlotte this afternoon." The call disconnected. Dr. Chen immediately relayed this information to Colonel Harrington via radio, adding urgency to the recovery operation already underway. Thomas stared at the ancient oak, its massive branches swaying gently in the morning breeze, seemingly oblivious to the human drama unfolding around it. For 600 years it had stood on this hillside, its roots reaching deep into whatever mysterious formation lay beneath, its branches sheltering generations of his family. Now he understood why his ancestors had protected it so fiercely. They had been guardians not just of a tree, but of a power they may not have fully understood. A power that was now stirring in ways that had drawn the attention of both the government and, unwittingly, the developers whose actions threatened to release it. Thomas Calloway had crossed a threshold. There was no going back to the simple life he had known yesterday. The oak his family had protected for generations was now revealed to be something far more significant and potentially dangerous than he had ever imagined, and he had become its guardian in a time of unprecedented crisis. Narrator. The confrontation at the security perimeter ended with the Emerald Creek executives retreating, but Thomas knew their departure was temporary. Colonel Harrington had shown them documentation that superseded local jurisdiction, emergency powers granted to the Army Corps of Engineers for environmental hazard containment, but corporate lawyers were undoubtedly already working to challenge the federal intervention. While that battle would play out in offices and courtrooms, Thomas focused on the more immediate mystery unfolding beneath his ancient oak. With his grandfather's journals spread before him in the mobile command center, he began searching for any clues that might have been hiding in plain sight all these years. "There's a pattern to his weather observations," Thomas noted, comparing entries across several years. He documents unusual clarity of the night sky above the oak, especially during certain astronomical alignments. Dr. Chen looked up from the hidden parchment she was analyzing. The other Verdant sites show similar patterns. The energy fields seem to respond to celestial positioning, particularly during solstices and specific planetary alignments. Thomas turned to an entry from June 1962. Here, he writes about unusual illumination in the night garden during the summer solstice. "I always thought he was being poetic, describing moonlight or fireflies." Dr. Chen moved to examine the journal. "The summer solstice would align with one of our documented energy cycle peaks. Your grandfather was observing the actual energy manifestation, though describing it in terms that wouldn't raise suspicion if anyone else read his journals." The more Thomas examined the journals with this new understanding, the more patterns emerged. His grandfather had documented soil samples taken in concentric circles around the oak, noting variations in mineral content and fertility. What had seemed like ordinary agricultural record-keeping now revealed itself as systematic monitoring of the energy field's effects on the surrounding ecosystem. Most telling were the small symbols Edward Callaway had included beside certain entries, symbols that matched those on the hidden parchment. These appeared most frequently during years divisible by 19, which Dr. Chen explained corresponded to the metonic cycle, a period after which the phases of the moon recur on the same day of the year. "Your grandfather was tracking the energy cycle with remarkable precision," Dr. Chen observed, clearly impressed. These observations would have been invaluable to Project Verdant. Thomas felt a complicated pride in his grandfather's secret work, mixed with lingering confusion about why the knowledge hadn't been passed down directly. "Why wouldn't he tell my father, or leave instructions for me?" Colonel Harrington, who had returned from the perimeter confrontation, offered a perspective. "In my experience, Mr. Callaway, the burden of classified knowledge can be substantial. Your grandfather may have been protecting your father, allowing him to live without security restrictions, without the weight of secrets." "And me?" Thomas asked. "According to our records, your grandfather filed paperwork to brief you when you turned 35, the age he deemed appropriate for the responsibility. His death occurred 3 months before the scheduled disclosure." The revelation struck Thomas deeply. He had been 34 when his grandfather passed away, just months short of learning the truth that now seemed so obvious in retrospect. How different might his life have been with that knowledge? Would he have made the same choices, seen the farm and the oak with different eyes? These reflections were interrupted by a technician entering the command center. "Dr. Chen, we've completed the preliminary ground scans. You'll want to see this immediately." The team gathered around a large monitor displaying three-dimensional imaging of what lay beneath the ancient oak. Thomas stared in astonishment at the visualization. A complex network of root structures extending far deeper than normal for even the oldest oak trees, intertwined with what appeared to be an artificial chamber, approximately 40 feet below. The surface. "That can't be natural," Thomas stated, pointing to the geometric precision of the chamber walls. "It's not," Colonel Harrington confirmed. "We've encountered similar structures at 3 of the 5 confirmed sites. They appear to predate European settlement of North America by several centuries, possibly millennia." Dr. Chen manipulated the display to highlight an unusual formation at the center of the chamber. "This is what's generating the energy signature. We call it a node, a crystalline structure that interfaces between geological processes and the tree's biological systems." The visualization showed how the oak's deepest roots had grown around and through this crystalline formation, creating what appeared to be a symbiotic relationship between the living tree and whatever lay beneath it. "Is it artificial?" Thomas asked, struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. "That's a complicated question," Dr. Chen replied. "The crystalline structures appear to form naturally under certain geological conditions, but the chambers housing them show clear signs of intelligent construction. It's as if someone in the distant past recognized the significance of these formations and built protective structures around them, then cultivated specific trees to serve as conduits." Colonel Harrington added, "Carbon dating from the other sites suggests the chambers were constructed between 500 and 800 CE, though the crystalline formations themselves appear to be significantly older." Thomas tried to process this information. So, people living in North America over 1,000 years ago built underground chambers to house these energy-producing crystals, then planted trees to what? Harvest the energy. "We believe the relationship is more sophisticated than simple energy harvesting," Dr. Chen explained. "The trees don't just extract energy, they appear to regulate it, creating a stable, sustainable system that can function indefinitely if left undisturbed." This aligned with something Thomas had observed in his grandfather's journals. "My grandfather noted that during drought years, plants near the oak suffered less than those farther away. And during particularly wet seasons, the area around the oak showed better drainage." Dr. Chen nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly. The system appears to moderate environmental extremes in its immediate vicinity. One theory is that these installations were created as climate stabilization technologies, a network of sites working together to influence regional weather patterns and ensure agricultural productivity." Who could have built something like this? Thomas wondered aloud. Colonel Harrington's expression turned grave. "That's where the historical record fails us. The civilization responsible for these installations left few traces beyond the chambers themselves. Most anthropologists aren't even aware such technology existed in pre-Columbian North America." Technician approached with a tablet displaying new data. "Dr. Chen, we're detecting increasing energy fluctuations from the node. The removal of the core sample appears to have disrupted the regulatory function of the tree." Thomas thought of the missing sample now being transported to Charlotte. How dangerous is this disruption? Dr. Chen studied the readings with concern. If the energy continues to build without the tree's full regulatory capacity, we could see local effects similar to electromagnetic pulse phenomena, disruption of electrical systems, unusual weather patterns, potentially even geological instability. My God, Thomas murmured, the full significance finally hitting him. The oak isn't just a tree, it's a control system for something much more powerful. Precisely, Colonel Harrington confirmed, which is why your family's protection of it has been so crucial, whether they fully understood its function or not. Thomas turned to additional pages in his grandfather's journal, now seeing the coded warnings and observations with new clarity. Edward Callaway had documented subtle changes in the oak's energy patterns following a lightning strike in 1967. The careful steps he had taken to protect the damaged section of trunk and the gradual return to normal readings over the following months. He knew exactly what he was guarding, Thomas realized. All those hours he spent tending the oak, he wasn't just caring for a tree, he was maintaining a system. A sudden thought struck Thomas. The spring near the oak, could it be connected to the underground chamber? Dr. Chen looked up with interest. What spring? Thomas led them from the command center toward the natural spring that bubbled up from the ground about 50 yards from the oak. A permanent water source that had served Hickory Ridge Farm since its establishment. As they approached, instrumentation carried by one of the technicians began registering increasing energy readings. The water is flowing through the crystalline formation, Dr. Chen realized, examining the readings. It's carrying trace elements of the same material we found in the tree. Thomas knelt beside the spring, where generations of Callaways had drawn, drinking water. Is it safe? My family has been drinking from this spring for over a century. Dr. Chen directed a technician to take samples, but her expression was reassuring. Based on findings at similar sites, the trace elements are likely beneficial rather than harmful. They may explain the unusual longevity noted in communities surrounding other verdant locations. This sparked a memory for Thomas. Riverdale County has an unusually high number of centenarians. Local doctors have been studying the phenomenon for years, never finding a conclusive explanation. Colonel Harrington exchanged meaningful glances with Dr. Chen. The health effects of proximity to verdant sites remain classified, Mr. Callaway, but yes, certain statistical anomalies have been documented in communities surrounding all 5 confirmed locations. Thomas stared at the spring with new wonder. The water that had nourished his family for generations might have been subtly influencing their health all along. Another benefit of their stewardship of the ancient oak and whatever mysterious technology lay beneath it. Their investigation was interrupted by urgent communication from the team dispatched to recover the missing core sample. The news was concerning. The sample had indeed been transported to Charlotte before they arrived, but not to the development company's research facility as expected. Instead, it had been diverted to a private laboratory with military connections. Someone else knows about the Verdant sites, Colonel Harrington stated grimly, issuing rapid orders to redirect resources. This is no longer just about containing an energy disruption. We may have a security breach. Thomas's phone rang, the display showing Catherine Bennett's number. He answered immediately, putting the call on speaker. Mr. Callaway. Catherine's voice was hushed, suggesting she was speaking somewhere private. I've been suspended pending investigation. They know I called you. Are you safe? Thomas asked, concerned by her tone. For now, but you should know. The sample wasn't sent to our Charlotte facility. Our CEO personally delivered it to a private company called Quantum Horizon. They specialize in experimental energy technologies and have Defense Department contracts. Colonel Harrington's expression darkened. Ms. Bennett, this is Colonel Harrington, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Do you have any documentation regarding this transfer? I made copies of the chain of custody forms before they locked me out of the system, she confirmed. I can send them to you. Something isn't right here. Our CEO has been acting strange ever since the preliminary analysis of that sample came back. It's like he was expecting those results. Thomas and Colonel Harrington exchanged troubled looks. The implication was clear. Someone at Emerald Creek Development might have known about the oak's special properties before they attempted to remove it. This was no longer a simple case of developers threatening a historic tree for better views. It suggested a targeted attempt to acquire the crystalline material for unknown purposes. "Miss Bennett, we need that documentation immediately," Colonel Harrington directed. "And any information you have on previous communications between your CEO and Quantum Horizon." "I'll send everything I have," she promised, "but there's something else you should know. Before I was escorted out, I overheard our chief counsel say something about the other sites, like this wasn't the only place they were investigating. This revelation sent a ripple of alarm through the command team. If Emerald Creek Development or their associates at Quantum Horizon were actively targeting Verdant sites, the implications extended far beyond Hickory Ridge Farm. "Thank you, Ms. Bennett," Thomas said sincerely. "Please be careful. These people clearly don't want this information getting out." After the call ended, Colonel Harrington immediately initiated secure communications with Project Verdant headquarters, reporting the potential security breach and requesting heightened monitoring at all known sites. Thomas returned to the oak, standing beneath its sprawling canopy, with a profound new understanding of his family's legacy. For generations, the Callaways had protected this tree without fully comprehending its significance, guided by an intuitive understanding that it was worth preserving at all costs. Now Thomas knew why. The ancient oak wasn't just a tree. It was part of a sophisticated system created by unknown ancestors, a technology both biological and mineral that had functioned harmoniously for centuries until modern development threatened to disrupt it. And somehow certain powerful interests had learned about these sites and were actively working to acquire their crystalline materials that could potentially revolutionize energy production if their properties could be harnessed. As the afternoon sun filtered through the oak's leaves, casting dappled shadows across the ground where so many generations of his family had stood, Thomas Calloway realized that his stand against the developers had been just the beginning of a much larger battle, one with stakes far beyond the boundaries of Hickory Ridge Farm. Narrator. As evening approached, Thomas retreated to his farmhouse kitchen, seeking a moment of normalcy amidst the extraordinary events unfolding on his property. The simple act of brewing coffee in the same pot his father had used before him provided a tenuous connection to the life he had known just 24 hours earlier, a life unburdened by knowledge of crystalline nodes, energy signatures, and ancient underground chambers. Colonel Harrington had established a rotating security detail around the oak, with technicians monitoring the increasingly erratic energy fluctuations emanating from beneath it. The recovery team was still tracking the missing core sample, now confirmed to be in the possession of Quantum Horizon at their research facility outside Charlotte. A legal team from the Army Corps of Engineers was preparing documentation to compel its immediate surrender, citing national security concerns. Thomas sat at his kitchen table, the worn oak surface bearing the marks of 5 generations of Callaway. Family meals, discussions, and decisions. He spread before him the oldest of his family journals, Jeremiah Callaway's leather-bound record of the farm's establishment after the Civil War. Thomas had read it many times over the years, finding practical farming wisdom and connection to his roots. Now he searched its pages for something deeper, something his ancestors might have encoded about the true nature of Hickory Ridge Farm. The early entries documented Jeremiah's recovery from wounds sustained at Gettysburg, his search for suitable farmland, and his eventual purchase of the property in 1866, what had always seemed like the sentimental musings of a war-weary veteran now revealed potential deeper meanings. Found the sentinel oak today, standing watch just as described in the papers. The spring flows sweet and clear, and the alignment is true to the old maps. This is the place. The guardian must stand here. The reference to papers and old maps suggested Jeremiah had been working from prior documentation, not simply searching for productive farmland, but seeking a specific location. Most telling was the phrase, "The guardian must stand here," which Thomas had always interpreted as poetic language about establishing a homestead. Now it carried unmistakable echoes of the guarding function his family had maintained for generations. Thomas flipped forward several pages, finding an entry from the autumn equinox of 1867, dug the root cellar today, carefully avoiding the deep anchors as instructed. The soil changes notably at 12 feet, becomes almost crystalline and strangely warm to touch. Have marked this area as unsuitable for further excavation to ensure no accidental disturbance. The tree seems to approve. Its leaves remained green and full 3 weeks longer than others in the valley. This entry sent a chill down Thomas's spine. Jeremiah had known, or at least suspected, that something unusual lay beneath the oak. The instructions he mentioned suggested guidance from some external source, knowledge passed to him deliberately. A knock at the kitchen door interrupted Thomas's reading. Dr. Chen stood there looking exhausted after hours of intensive analysis. "May I come in?" The command center gets a bit claustrophobic after a while. Thomas welcomed her, offering coffee, which she gratefully accepted. As she sat across from him at the kitchen table, her eyes fell on Jeremiah's journal. "Your great-great-grandfather's records?" Thomas nodded. He knew something was down there. He deliberately avoided excavating near the deep root system when building the farm's root cellar. He called it following instructions. Dr. Chen considered this information carefully. "Mr. Callaway, how much do you know about the Grand Army of the Republic, the Union Veterans Organization?" "Not much beyond the basics. Jeremiah was a member, I believe." The GAR had a special internal division, officially called the Conservation Corps, but known informally as the Sentinels. Their stated mission was preserving historically significant natural landmarks, but declassified records suggest a more specific focus. Thomas leaned forward. "They were protecting the Verdant sites, weren't they?" Dr. Chen nodded. After the Civil War, industrialization accelerated dramatically across America. Railways, mining operations, and timber harvesting threatened many previously undisturbed areas, including several locations with documented energy signatures. The Conservation Corps identified veterans with suitable backgrounds and positioned them as landowners at critical sites. "So my family's connection to this land wasn't accidental," Thomas said softly. "Jeremiah was recruited, just like my grandfather. Was a century later. We believe many of the original guardians weren't told exactly what they were protecting, only that it was vital to the nation's future security. The emphasis on environmental stewardship would have resonated with war veterans, seeking peaceful purpose." Thomas thought of his own military service, how the chaos and destruction he'd witnessed had intensified his commitment to preserving his small corner of the world when he returned home. Had Jeremiah felt the same way after Gettysburg? Had that made him the perfect candidate to guard something precious without fully understanding what it was? Dr. Chen sipped her coffee, then continued. "Project Verdant originated from discoveries made during the Manhattan Project. Scientists detected unusual energy signatures near certain ancient trees while searching for uranium deposits. When they investigated further, they found the crystalline formations and evidence of the artificial chambers. The project was classified immediately, and my grandfather became involved in 1958, Thomas added, the timeline finally making sense, during the drought that nearly cost him the farm. The drought created ideal conditions for energy detection. less groundwater interference with our monitoring equipment, your grandfather's military background and position as the property owner made him an ideal candidate for direct recruitment. Thomas closed Jeremiah's journal, his mind working through generations of family history with this new understanding. So each generation of my family has been protecting this site, first unknowingly, then with partial knowledge, and finally with full awareness. The pattern is consistent across all 5 confirmed Verdant locations, Dr. Chen confirmed. Family stewardship provides the most reliable long-term protection. Corporate or government ownership introduces too many variables, too many opportunities for personnel changes or policy shifts that might expose the sites. Thomas stood and walked to the kitchen window, looking out toward the ancient oak now illuminated by floodlights, as work continued through the evening. The tree that had been part of his daily landscape since childhood suddenly seemed both more familiar and more mysterious, a living connection to something ancient and powerful. "There's something I don't understand," Thomas said, turning back. To Dr. Chen, "If Project Verdant has been monitoring these sites for decades, why didn't you intervene sooner when the development threatened the oak?" Dr. Chen's expression grew troubled. Budget constraints and changing priorities after the Cold War led to reduced monitoring of all sites. The system was largely automated with minimal human oversight. Your tree wasn't triggering alert thresholds. Until yesterday, after the core sample was taken, Thomas concluded. Exactly. The extraction created an instability in the energy regulation system, like removing a vital component from a dam's control mechanisms. The energy that had been flowing in a controlled manner for centuries suddenly had a path of less resistance. This explanation triggered another memory for Thomas, something his grandfather had told him during a severe thunderstorm when Thomas was just 8 years old. They had watched from the farmhouse porch as lightning struck repeatedly near the oak, yet never hit the tree itself. "My grandfather said the oak knows how to channel the sky's fire safely back to the earth. I thought it was just a comforting story for a frightened child. But he was describing its actual function, wasn't he?" Dr. Chen leaned forward with interest. "That's a remarkably accurate simplification of the energy regulation process. The system essentially creates a balanced circuit between geothermal energy, rising from below, and atmospheric electricity from above, with the tree serving as a living transformer and regulator." Thomas remembered something else. The small metal object his grandfather had shown him years ago, claiming to have found it near the oak's roots after a storm. He described it to Dr. Chen, watching her expression shift from polite interest to intense focus. "Do you still have this object?" she asked urgently. "Possibly. My grandfather kept a box of odd items he'd found around the property over the years. Should be in the attic still." Thomas led Dr. Chen upstairs to the farmhouse attic, a space largely unchanged since his grandfather's time. Among the expected accumulation of family heirlooms and seasonal items stood an old sea chest that had belonged to a Callaway who briefly served in the Navy during the Spanish-American War. Inside, carefully organized in small compartments, were dozens of objects his grandfather had collected over decades of farming. Unusual stones, artifacts from previous centuries, and items of personal significance. In a felt-lined box near the bottom of the chest, Thomas found what he was looking for, a metal object approximately 4 inches long, shaped like an elongated hexagon with intricate patterns etched into its surface. It had the weight and color of silver, but had never tarnished despite decades in storage. Dr. Chen accepted it reverently, examining it under the attic's single light bulb. "This is a regulation key," she breathed, her professional composure momentarily broken by genuine awe. "Only 2 others have ever been recovered, one at the New York site in 1976, another in Georgia in 2002. Regulation key? For what?" Based on laboratory analysis of the others, we believe these devices were used to manually adjust the energy flow between the crystalline node and the tree, essentially maintenance tools for the original builders or operators of the system. Thomas stared at the unassuming object that had rested in his family's possession for decades, an ancient technological component disguised as a curious trinket. Can it help stabilize the current situation with the energy fluctuations? Dr. Chen carefully wrapped the key in her handkerchief. Potentially. We've never had the opportunity to test one at an active site during a disruption event. This could be critically important, Mr. Callaway. As they descended from the attic, Thomas's phone rang. Catherine Bennett again. Thomas, she said without preamble, her voice tense. I've been followed since leaving the office. 2 men in a black SUV. I'm at the Riverdale diner now, but I don't think it's safe for me to go home. Colonel Harrington, who had just entered the farmhouse to update them on the security situation, immediately took charge. Ms. Bennett, this is Colonel Harrington. I'm dispatching a security team to your location now. Stay in a public place, preferably with security cameras. There's something else, Catherine continued. Before I left, I accessed our CEO's calendar. He has a meeting scheduled tomorrow morning with representatives from all 3 major development companies in the region. The subject line reads, Acquisition of Heritage Properties. I think they're targeting all the old family farms that remain in the area. Thomas and Colonel Harrington exchanged alarmed glances. The Colonel's next question confirmed their shared suspicion. Miss Bennett, do any of those properties contain notably ancient trees or unusual natural features? The line went silent for a moment. Yes, Catherine finally replied. Every acquisition target has a landmark tree or natural spring mentioned in the environmental survey. I thought it was just about securing the most scenic properties for development, but now they're hunting for the other nodes, Thomas realized aloud. Using development companies as cover for systematic identification and acquisition of Verdant sites, Colonel Harrington immediately initiated urgent communications with Project Verdant headquarters, while Dr. Chen carefully placed the regulation key in a specialized containment case she retrieved from the command center. Thomas stood in his family kitchen, the weight of his heritage settling on him with new significance. His ancestors hadn't simply been farmers with a sentimental attachment to an old oak tree. They had been links in a chain of guardianship stretching back to the aftermath of the Civil War, possibly further. Each generation had protected something. They understood only partially, acting on an instinct for stewardship that ran deeper than rational explanation. Now Thomas stood at a crucial juncture in that lineage. The system his family had guarded for generations was facing unprecedented threats. Not just from unwitting developers, but from informed adversaries who apparently understood enough about the Verdant sites to target them specifically. As he looked out toward the ancient oak, illuminated against the night sky, Thomas felt something stir within him, a sense of connection not just to his human ancestors, but to the land itself, to the mysterious energy flowing beneath it, and to the ancient oak that had stood sentinel through centuries of human drama. Whatever force had selected Jeremiah Callaway to guard this place after the Civil War, whatever instinct had guided his grandfather to maintain that vigil during the Cold War, now flowed through Thomas as he faced a new chapter in this ancient responsibility. The Guardian was standing in his appointed place, just as Jeremiah had written 150 years earlier, and he would not fail on his watch. Dawn broke over Hickory Ridge Farm with an unnatural stillness. The birds that usually greeted the morning with enthusiastic chorus remained silent, as if sensing the tension that permeated the air. Thomas stood on his porch, coffee mug in hand, watching the first light illuminate the ancient oak that had become the center of an escalating situation far beyond anything he could have imagined 2 days earlier. The Army Corps team had worked through the night, establishing a secure perimeter around the tree and deploying specialized equipment to monitor the increasingly erratic energy fluctuations. Catherine Bennett had been safely extracted from the Riverdale diner and brought to the farm, where she provided critical intelligence about Emerald Creek Development's systematic targeting of potential Verdant sites across the region. Morning. Status report, sir. A young lieutenant approached Thomas, tablet in hand. Energy fluctuations increased 27% overnight. Dr. Chen believes we have approximately 12 hours before the disruption reaches critical levels. Thomas nodded grimly. The missing core sample had created a growing instability in the system, like a leak in a pressurized vessel that steadily worsens over time. If they couldn't stabilize the energy flow soon, the consequences could extend well beyond Hickory Ridge Farm. Colonel Harrington emerged from the mobile command center, his expression betraying the seriousness of the situation despite his military composure. Mr. Callaway, we've received intelligence that Quantum Horizon has accelerated their analysis of the core sample. They're attempting to artificially replicate the crystalline formation in a laboratory environment. Is that even possible? Thomas asked. Theoretically, no. The formations develop through a symbiotic relationship between geological processes and living tree roots over centuries. But their attempts could further destabilize the original sample, potentially triggering a cascading reaction that could affect the entire node. Catherine Bennett joined them, looking exhausted but determined after her ordeal. I've compiled documentation linking Emerald Creek to Quantum Horizon through a network of shell companies. They've been working together for at least 3 years, systematically acquiring properties with specific geological and biological markers. Thomas watched the team of scientists gathered around the ancient oak, their equipment creating an incongruous blend of cutting-edge technology and ancient natural power. Dr. Chen was carefully examining the regulation key Thomas had discovered, consulting with specialists about its potential implementation. What happens if we can't stabilize it? Thomas asked Colonel Harrington directly. The colonel hesitated before answering. Best case scenario, a localized EMP effect that would disrupt electronics within a 20-mile radius. Worst case, he paused, the New Madrid incident of 1811. Thomas's blood ran cold. The New Madrid earthquakes were among the most powerful ever recorded in North America, felt across more than 1 million square miles, despite occurring in a region not typically associated with seismic activity. Are you saying those earthquakes were caused by a failure in one of these systems? The historical record suggests a correlation between the earthquake sequence and unusual atmospheric phenomena consistent with an uncontrolled energy discharge. From a Verdant site, Native American oral histories from the region describe the sleeping power beneath the guardian tree awakening in anger when settlers cut down an ancient cypress. Thomas looked toward the oak with new understanding of the responsibility his family had carried for generations, a responsibility far weightier than he had ever imagined. What had begun as a simple stand to protect a beloved tree had evolved into a race to prevent potential catastrophe. Dr. Chen approached, carrying a secure case containing the regulation key. We've analyzed the device and believe we understand its basic function. The crystalline structures in the oak's root system have specific channels that appear designed to accommodate this key, allowing manual adjustment of energy flow between the node and the tree. You're going to use it? Thomas asked. With your permission, yes. This is still your property, Mr. Callaway, and technically the key belongs to your family. Despite our federal authority, we respect the tradition of guardianship that has preserved this site for generations. Thomas appreciated the acknowledgement of his family's role, even as the situation had escalated beyond anything his ancestors could have anticipated. What do you need from me? According to records from the other sites where regulation keys were recovered, these devices responded to specific individuals, typically those with bloodline connections to the property. We believe the system may recognize certain genetic markers. You're saying the key might only work for me, Thomas clarified. It's a theory we'd like to test. The journals recovered from other guardian families suggest a ceremonial component to the regulation process. Specific individuals performing specific actions at specific times. Thomas thought of his grandfather's meticulous notes about celestial alignments and energy cycles, the careful observations recorded through generations of Callaways. My family has been preparing for this moment without fully understanding what they were preparing for. As they discussed implementation plans, alarms suddenly blared from the monitoring equipment surrounding the oak. Technicians rushed to their stations, calling out readings that meant little to Thomas but clearly alarmed the specialists. Energy surge in progress, a scientist announced, levels increasing exponentially, estimated 30 minutes to critical threshold. Dr. Chen's expression tightened. We've run out of time for further analysis. Mr. Callaway, we need to attempt regulation now. The team moved with practiced efficiency, establishing a direct path to the massive root structure they had partially excavated. Thomas followed Dr. Chen toward the ancient oak that had defined his family for generations, carrying the regulation key that had rested in his attic for decades, waiting for precisely this moment. As they approached the exposed root system, Thomas felt an unusual sensation, a subtle vibration that seemed to resonate through his body, intensifying as he drew closer to the tree. The massive oak's leaves rustled despite the absence of wind, as if acknowledging his presence. The system is responding to you, Dr. Chen observed, with scientific fascination. Sensors indicate localized stabilization in your immediate vicinity. The excavated area revealed an intricate network of roots surrounding what appeared to be a small chamber formed within the earth itself. At the center of this natural vault lay an unmistakably artificial structure, a hexagonal opening lined with the same crystalline material they had observed in the core samples, pulsing with an internal light that shifted between blue and amber. That's the access point, Dr. Chen indicated, gesturing to the hexagonal opening. Based on our analysis, the regulation key should interface with it directly. Thomas knelt beside the opening, the regulation key growing noticeably warmer in his hand as he brought it closer to the crystalline structure. The vibration he had felt earlier intensified, resonating now between the key and his own body in a way that defied scientific explanation but felt innately right. What exactly do I do? Thomas asked, suddenly aware of the profound responsibility of the moment. Dr. Chen consulted her data. According to records from the Georgia site, the key must be aligned with specific formations within the crystalline structure, then rotated in sequence with the energy pulses. Thomas studied the pulsing light within the hexagonal opening, then looked at the patterns etched into the regulation key. There was a familiarity to them that transcended conscious knowledge, as if some part of him recognized this process at a level deeper than rational thought. I think I understand, he said quietly, positioning the key at the opening. As the key made contact with the crystalline structure, the light patterns shifted dramatically, forming concentric rings that pulsed in sequence from the center outward. Thomas felt rather than heard a resonant tone, a deep vibration that seemed to connect him, the key, and the ancient oak in a single harmonious system. Acting on instinct more than instruction, Thomas aligned the key with the pulsing light patterns and began a careful rotation that matched their rhythm. With each quarter turn, the vibration changed frequency, the light shifted color, and the monitoring equipment recorded stabilizing energy patterns. It's working, Dr. Chen confirmed, watching the readings with barely contained excitement. The system is rebalancing itself. The process continued for several minutes, Thomas working in silent communion with the ancient technology. As he completed what intuitively felt like the final sequence, a sudden pulse of emerald light emanated from the crystalline structure, traveling visibly up through the oak's root system and into its trunk. Above them, the massive canopy of the Callaway Oak shimmered momentarily with the same emerald light, visible even in the morning sunlight. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the unusual phenomena subsided, leaving only the natural beauty of the ancient tree against the blue sky. "Energy levels stabilizing," announced a technician monitoring the equipment. "Returning to baseline parameters." For the first time since the core sample extraction, Colonel Harrington approached, relief evident beneath his professional demeanor. "Well done, Mr. Callaway. Preliminary readings suggest you've successfully rebalanced the system." Thomas carefully withdrew the regulation key, which now bore subtle new markings etched into its surface, a record of its use encoded in the material itself. As he stood, he felt a profound connection to the oak that transcended his previous understanding. This wasn't just his family's tree, it was a living partner in a relationship that stretched across centuries. "What about the core sample?" Thomas asked, "and Quantum Horizon's attempts to replicate the crystalline structure?" "That's being addressed as we speak," Colonel Harrington assured him. "A specialized team secured the sample during the night. The documentation Ms. Bennett provided gave us sufficient cause for immediate intervention under national security protocols." Catherine Bennett stepped forward. "Emerald Creek's CEO and 3 executives have been taken into custody for questioning. The evidence trail suggests they've been systematically identifying and targeting Verdant sites for at least 5 years." "How many sites have they compromised?" Thomas asked. "None successfully," Colonel Harrington replied. "Your family's steadfast protection of this tree prevented what could have been the first breach. The other guardian families have been similarly resistant to selling, despite increasing pressure and financial incentives." Thomas thought of the other families like his own, generations of guardians protecting ancient trees across the country, perhaps without fully understanding what lay beneath them or the broader system they were part of. There was comfort in knowing he wasn't alone in this responsibility, that others had maintained similar vigils on their own land. As the day progressed, the Army Corps team began the process of carefully restoring the excavated area around the oak's roots, ensuring the crystalline access point was properly protected while maintaining the tree's natural environment. Dr. Chen supervised the work personally, treating the site with the reverence of a sacred space rather than a mere research location. "What happens now?" Thomas asked Colonel Harrington as they watched the restoration work. "Officially, this incident will be classified under environmental protection protocols, government intervention to preserve a historically significant tree on private property. Unofficially, Project Verdant will establish enhanced monitoring of this and all other known sites, with improved communication protocols between guardian families. So my farm goes back to normal, just growing crops and tending an ancient oak tree." The colonel smiled. "As normal as it ever was, Mr. Callaway, though your understanding of your family's legacy has certainly changed." By late afternoon, most of the military presence had been withdrawn, leaving only a small monitoring team that would remain for several days to ensure the system's stability. The regulation key had been entrusted back to Thomas's care, with proper documentation of its significance and instructions for its use should similar circumstances arise in the future. Catherine Bennett approached Thomas as he stood beneath the oak, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of orange and purple. "They've offered me a position with Project Verdant," she said. "Environmental liaison officer, helping identify and protect potential sites before developers can target them. You'll be good at that," Thomas observed. "You already saved this one." "I've always believed some things are worth protecting," she replied, gazing up at the ancient oak. "I just never imagined anything quite like this." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a distinguished-looking elderly man who introduced himself as Dr. James Whittaker, the current director of Project Verdant. He had flown in specifically to meet Thomas and assess the situation firsthand. "Your family has maintained one of our most important sites for generations, Mr. Callaway," Dr. Whittaker said, shaking Thomas's hand warmly. "Few have shown such dedication across time." "We didn't know exactly what we were protecting," Thomas admitted, "just that it was important." "That's the essence of true stewardship," Dr. Whittaker replied. "Caring for something beyond your complete understanding, trusting in its intrinsic value rather than its immediate utility. Your ancestors would be proud of how you've continued their legacy." As twilight deepened over Hickory Ridge Farm, Thomas sat alone on his porch, contemplating all that had transpired in the span of just a few days. The ancient oak stood silhouetted against the darkening sky, its massive canopy a reassuring presence that had watched over his family for generations. Colonel Harrington had promised that the farm would remain under Thomas's full control, with Project Verdant providing discreet support and monitoring rather than governmental interference. The development threat had been neutralized, with Emerald Creek facing federal investigations that would occupy them for years to come. Most importantly, Thomas now understood his place in a lineage that stretched back far beyond what he had previously imagined. Not just 5 generations of Callaways farming this land, but a sacred trust extending to the ancient builders who had created the underground system and planted the first trees to protect it. The regulation key rested in a custom-made display case on his mantle, a tangible reminder of his responsibility and connection to something ancient and powerful. His grandfather's journals had been carefully preserved, their coded observations now recognized as valuable scientific data spanning decades. As stars appeared in the night sky, Thomas thought of Jeremiah Callaway, returning wounded from Gettysburg, finding purpose and healing in guarding this special place. He thought of his grandfather Edward, maintaining that vigil through the challenges of the mid-20th century, carefully documenting energy cycles and celestial alignments while presenting the public face of a simple farmer. And he thought of his own journey, from a farmer fighting developers to save a beloved family tree, to a guardian consciously protecting a node in an ancient network designed to stabilize the very earth beneath his feet. Thomas Callaway's stand against the bulldozers had been just the beginning of a much larger story, one that connected him to both his family's past and a responsibility that would extend far into the future. The ancient oak would continue to stand sentinel over Hickory Ridge Farm, its roots intertwined with crystalline mysteries deep beneath the soil, its branches reaching toward stars that had guided guardians for centuries. And Thomas would stand with it, the latest in a long line of guardians, protecting something precious not just for himself or his family, but for the world that depended on it, whether they knew it or not. Narrator. Thomas Callaway's story represents the countless quiet guardians who protect special places across our world, people who stand firm against development and destruction, often without fully understanding the true significance of what they're preserving. In standing for his ancient oak, Thomas discovered not just his family's legacy but his own purpose. The Army Corps engineers who surrounded his property that morning hadn't come to remove the tree, but to help protect something whose value transcended ordinary understanding. Sometimes, what seems like opposition to progress is actually the preservation of wisdom, far older and deeper than we initially recognize. If this story touched something in you, remember to subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments below. Who knows what ancient wonders might be quietly growing in your own backyard, waiting for the right guardian to protect them when their moment of need arrives.